Ladies and gentlemen, there was once a woman who sat alone in the break room at lunch. Every day, same time, same table, same silence. People didn't dislike her. They just didn't know her. Some said she was too quiet. Some said she kept to herself. Others simply didn't notice her at all. She had no friends. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Maybe she's difficult. Maybe she's cold. Maybe she just doesn't care. But what if that woman was once the warmest person in the room? What if she once gave everything to others until there was nothing left for herself? What if she trusted the wrong people and paid for it? You see, we often judge people based on what we see in a moment, but we forget that people are stories, not snapshots. A woman with no friends isn't always lonely, and a woman surrounded by people isn't always loved. We live in a world obsessed with connection, followers, likes, networking, social circles. But real connection, that's rare, that's sacred, and it requires something most people are afraid to give: vulnerability. The woman with no friends might not be broken. She might be healing. She might be the one who chose peace over popularity. She might have walked away from toxic relationships to protect her spirit. She might be the kind of person who would rather sit alone in truth than be surrounded by people who make her feel more alone in their presence. I once asked a woman, "Why don't you have any close friends?" She looked at me and said, "Because I grew tired of explaining my worth." Think about that. Sometimes we confuse solitude with sadness, but solitude can be strength. It can be the space where a woman rediscovers who she is when the noise of the world becomes too loud. But here's the deeper challenge. How do we create a culture where women like her don't have to choose between self-worth and friendship, where empathy is our default, not suspicion? In every workplace, in every community, there are women like her. Quiet warriors, wise souls, people who don't need a crowd to validate their value. Our job isn't to fix them. Our job is to see them, to extend an authentic hand without judgment, to say, "You don't have to explain who you are. I'm here, I'm listening." Because the truth is, some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who walked through the fire alone and came out not bitter, but better. So the next time you see a woman with no friends, don't ask, "What's wrong with her?" Ask, "What has she survived?" And maybe, just maybe, that question will open a door to something real. Would you like this translated into Urdu or adapted for a specific platform like YouTube or Instagram? The assumptions we make: we live in a world that is addicted to speed. Speed in conversations, speed in connections, speed in conclusions. So when we see a woman sitting by herself at lunch, walking alone at a social event, or simply not participating in group chatter, our minds race to label her. She's rude, she's antisocial, she thinks she's better than everyone else, or maybe she's just weird. The reality is, we fill in the gaps with our assumptions because it's easier than asking questions. It's easier than being curious, but that ease comes at a cost. The woman we're judging might have once been the heartbeat of a group, the person who lit up rooms and made others feel seen. But maybe something happened. Maybe a betrayal, a toxic friendship, a slow erosion of self-worth. Maybe she gave and gave until she broke, and now what you see is not her full story, but her recovery. It's dangerous to define people by the chapter you walked in on. Just like you wouldn't judge a book by reading a single sentence, you shouldn't judge a life by a single moment, yet we do it, because the truth is, our brains are wired to take shortcuts, stereotypes and assumptions. They save time, but they also rob us of connection. And here's the irony. We often misinterpret silence for weakness, distance for arrogance, and solitude for sadness, when in truth, that woman might be stronger than anyone in the room. She might be quiet not because she has nothing to say, but because she's tired of speaking into rooms that never really listened. The real tragedy isn't that she's sitting alone, it's that no one's sitting with her out of genuine curiosity. No one's asking, "What's your story?" And not to fix her, not to change her, but to know her, because knowing someone, that's a sacred act. It requires patience, it requires humility, and above all, it requires the willingness to let go of assumptions. So the next time you see someone who appears to be isolated, pause. Don't ask, "What's wrong with her?" Ask, what don't I know about her? That shift, from judgment to curiosity, can change the entire dynamic of a relationship. It can spark empathy where there was once distance. And sometimes that simple shift can be the reason someone decides to re-engage with the world. Because maybe all she needed wasn't a crowd or attention or 100 followers. Maybe all she needed was one person who saw her not as a label, but as a human being. We often think of friendship as a basic human need, and it is, but not all friendships are equal. Not all connection is healthy. And not all company is good for the soul. We grow up being told that more is better, more friends, more followers, more visibility. But there comes a point in life where quantity starts to suffocate quality. Where being surrounded by people still leaves you feeling unseen. That's what many people don't understand about a woman who has no friends. Sometimes she didn't lose them. She left them. There's a moment in every strong person's life when they realize that peace is more valuable than popularity. That their time, energy, and vulnerability are not infinite resources. They learn that being used, dismissed, or constantly put in a position where they have to earn basic respect chips away at you. One small moment at a time, so she steps back, she detaches, she chooses silence over small talk, truth over tolerance of toxicity, and that's often the beginning of her isolation, not from weakness but from wisdom. We glorify hustle culture and always being available to everyone, but what if saying no to draining people is actually an act of self-care? What if choosing solitude is a form of rebellion, a declaration that says, I deserve better than people who only show up when it benefits them? It's not easy to walk away, especially when the world is shouting at you, you need a tribe, you need a circle. But here's the thing, your value doesn't depend on how many people clap when you speak. It depends on how true you are to yourself when no one's watching. A woman who chooses to be alone isn't rejecting friendship, she's redefining it. She's learning that real connection doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't make her feel like she has to shrink to fit in. It doesn't keep score or guilt her into staying. Real connection is mutual, it's safe, it's honest, until she finds that, if she finds that she will sit alone, not in loneliness but in integrity. The world might look at her and see emptiness, but what she's really doing is making room for the right voices, the right energy, the right people, and that takes courage most people will never understand. Because it's easier to settle for noise than to sit with silence. But she has chosen silence not because it's comfortable, but because it's true. And in that truth, she is becoming whole again. So, the next time you look at a woman with no friends, remember, sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from the crowd and choose themselves. There's a phrase I once heard that stuck with me. She stopped watering connections that were never meant to grow. It speaks to something deeply powerful, something often misunderstood about women who stand alone. See, we often celebrate resilience after the storm has passed. But what about the resilience it takes to walk away from the storm in the first place? We don't talk enough about the pain of boundaries because yes, boundaries are healthy, they are essential, but they can also be isolating. When a woman starts to say no, when she starts to prioritize her peace over pleasing others, the invitations stop coming. The texts become fewer, the smiles turn into stares, and suddenly she's the one sitting alone at lunch, walking through the grocery store with her head down, wondering if she made the right decision. But here's the truth, growth often looks like loss in the beginning. We romanticize transformation, but we don't tell the whole story. We don't talk about how it feels to outgrow people. We don't talk about the guilt that comes when you leave a friendship that you've outlived. We don't talk about the heartbreak of realizing some people liked you better when you were smaller, when you needed their approval more than you needed yourself worth. The woman with no friends might be in that uncomfortable middle space, the space where she's no longer who she was, but not yet surrounded by the people who align with who she's becoming, and that's a lonely place. It's quiet, it's awkward, it feels like you're drifting between identities, between lives, but it's also necessary. You see, when you change, your environment doesn't always change with you. And so in that gap, you have to learn how to sit with yourself, to make peace with your own company, to stop fearing silence and start listening to what it's trying to tell you. That's where real transformation happens, not in the noise of others, but in the clarity of your own heart. The woman with no friends may have chosen this path not because she wanted to, but because the alternative was losing herself. She may still miss the comfort of community, but she refuses to settle for community that comes at the cost of authenticity. And that makes her powerful, not in a loud, performative way, but in a quiet, grounded, deeply aware way. Because once you've walked away from relationships that dimmed your light, you start to realize you were never too much. You were just too true for people who couldn't handle your growth. So when we see a woman alone, maybe instead of pitying her, we honor her. Maybe instead of labeling her, we learn from her. Because maybe she isn't alone because no one wants her. Maybe she's alone because she finally wants herself. There's a strange paradox in modern society. We are more connected than ever before, yet loneliness is at an all-time high. We scroll through curated highlight reels of other people's lives, convinced that everyone else has it figured out. Groups of friends, dinner parties, weekend getaways, endless laughter. And then we look at ourselves and wonder if we're the only ones left out. But let me say something clearly. Being alone does not mean being broken, and a woman without friends is not automatically a woman without value. In fact, she may have discovered something far more meaningful than superficial social comfort. She may have discovered herself. In a world that constantly tells women how they should act, how they should look, and even how they should belong, there's something radically empowering about choosing not to conform. About saying, I don't want to be part of something that doesn't nourish me. But that choice comes at a cost. People start to question you, whisper about you. They say, she's difficult, or she's closed off, or the most common one, she thinks she's better than everyone else. Because we've been conditioned to believe that being well, liked is more important than being well. We applaud friendliness even if it's fake. We reward fitting in even when it's at the expense of mental health. But the woman who no longer wants to perform, she's doing something sacred. She's choosing wholeness over likability. There's incredible strength in resisting the pressure to be constantly available, agreeable, and accommodating. In choosing to listen to your own voice rather than drown in the noise of others. And that's often what sets a woman with no friends apart. Not that she can't make friends, but that she's become intentional about who she allows into her world. That kind of discernment doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from experience, from pain, from lessons learned the hard way, from giving too much, too often, to people who never gave back. So now, instead of chasing approval, she seeks alignment. Instead of performing for inclusion, she protects her peace. And that doesn't mean she doesn't feel the ache of companionship. Of course she does. We all do. But she's learned that the ache of false friendship is much more dangerous than the temporary discomfort of solitude. This isn't a woman who's failed at friendship. This is a woman who's refused to fail herself. So many of us are afraid to be alone because we've equated solitude with rejection. But solitude, when chosen wisely, is actually a declaration of self-worth. It says, I will not shrink to be loved. So the next time you meet a woman who walks alone, don't assume she's lost. Maybe she's just following a path most people are too scared to take, the path toward her authentic self. We talk a lot about strength. We admire it in others. We chase it in ourselves. But have you ever considered what real strength actually looks like? It's not always loud. It doesn't always come wrapped in confidence or charisma. Sometimes real strength looks like a woman who gets up every day, shows up to work, handles her responsibilities, without a single person checking in on her, without anyone asking how she's really doing, without a shoulder to lean on or a friend to vent to. And yet, she continues. She continues not because she's superhuman, but because she's had no other choice. Life didn't give her the option of collapsing. She had to learn how to carry her own weight, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually. And in doing so, she became something most people don't understand, a woman who is completely self-sufficient. Now, we often romanticize independence, especially in women. But there's a difference between being independent and being forced into independence. Some women never got the luxury of being soft, or supported, or held. So they built walls not out of pride, but out of survival. The woman with no friends might be one of those women. She didn't wake up one day and decide to detach from the world. She was shaped by moments, disappointments, betrayals, misjudgments. She offered her trust, and it was mishandled. She gave loyalty, and it wasn't returned. Eventually, she learned that trusting the wrong people hurts more than being alone, and so she turned inward. She became her own source of comfort, her own counselor, her own safe space. To some, that might seem sad, but if you really think about it, it's extraordinary. Because while most people collapse without constant affirmation or community, she's figured out how to sustain herself. While others chase attention to validate their worth, she's chosen solitude to preserve her soul. She might not have a circle cheering her on, but she's learned how to clap for herself. She might not have someone to pick her up when she's low, but she's learned how to rise. Again and again. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When you're that strong, people don't often think you need anyone, so they stop checking in, they stop inviting, they assume you're fine, but no one is always fine. Even the strongest people need soft places to land. So the real question isn't just about why she has no friends. It's about what kind of world we've built where strong women are left alone because they don't ask for help. We must begin to recognize that independence doesn't mean invulnerability. That strength without support is not noble, it's exhausting. And maybe if more of us took the time to see past her self-sufficiency, we'd realize she's not intimidating. She's just tired of being let down, and what she truly deserves isn't pity or praise. It's presence. Real, honest, unwavering presence. There's something deeply human about being seen. I am not talking about visibility in the way social media defines it. Likes, followers, or attention. I'm talking about being truly seen, being known, being understood. The woman with no friends. She doesn't lack presence. She lacks witnesses. People who see her not just for what she does, but for who she is. People who notice the details, the tiredness behind her smile, the strength it took for her to show up today, the stories she carries quietly while others speak loudly. And that's one of the greatest losses in our culture today. We've confused connection with visibility. We think if someone is present, then they must be fine. If they're quiet, then they must be distant. But real connection requires effort. It requires intention. It requires that we stop, look up from our devices, and actually say, "Tell me who you are, not just what you do." This is especially true for women who walk alone. Too many times, society labels them unfriendly, cold, unapproachable. But often they're just guarded, and rightfully so, because we live in a world that often consumes more than it contributes, that takes more than it gives. And if you've been taken from enough times, eventually you stop offering. But imagine if, instead of assuming, we inquired. Imagine if, instead of pulling away from what we don't understand, we leaned in with compassion. What if we normalized saying, "I see you. I don't need you to be entertaining or cheerful or easy. I just want to know you." Because everyone has a story, and often, the people with no audience have the most powerful stories of all. The woman with no friends might be a teacher, a leader, a single mother, a caregiver, a survivor. She might be the one who holds everyone else together. But no one asks her who's holding her. That's the danger of silence. It becomes invisible. And when we don't speak, people assume there's nothing to be heard. But the opposite is true. Silence is often filled with the things we've never had the space to say. So here's the challenge for all of us. Let's create spaces where solitude isn't mistaken for failure, where strength isn't punished with neglect, and where a woman doesn't have to explain why she's sitting alone, because someone will choose to sit beside her. Not to rescue her, not to change her, but to remind her that she is worth knowing, even in her quietest moments. Because the truth is, the world doesn't need more friends. It needs more friendship, Not more circles, but more sincerity. Not more talk, but more trust. And maybe, just maybe, if we do that, the woman who had no friends won't need to explain her silence anymore. Because someone will finally say the words she's been waiting to hear.